So in this video, I'm going to do the Check Your Understanding problems 12-2. And there's solutions for these in the back of the book, but I also am going to ask you to graph these at some point. So I want to give you some guidance on that. So part 1A asks you to consider a rise in the consumer price index that leads producers to increase output. So first step is, like the last Check Your Understanding problems, is to set up your ADAS model. So I'm going to have quantity of output on the horizontal axis that I'm going to denote with a Y. And remember, I measure it using real GDP. And then on the vertical axis, I am going to have the price level, P. And I'm going to use to measure this the GDP deflator. I'm going to graph a hypothetical short-run aggregate supply curve. Short-run aggregate supply curve. Remember, in class we discussed two aggregate supply curves. In the short run, we argued that our suppliers can't change their production costs, and so our short-run aggregate supply curve rises from left to right, because the only option they have when the price level falls is to cut their supply. They can't cut their production costs, not in the short run. So our short run aggregate supply curve rises from left to right. And then, just for good measure, I'm going to pick a point on the short run aggregate supply curve, and just to help me consider the way we move. And I'm going to say that that corresponds to a level of aggregate output, Y sub 1, and it corresponds to a price level, P sub 1. And now I'm going to consider that the producers increase their output as a result of an increase in the rise in the consumer price index. This problem is a little tricky. Remember that when we consider whether we move along a curve or shift the entire curve, we want to ask, is the reason why we are changing because of a change in the price level? If it is, then what we are going to do is move along the curve. If it is not, then we are shifting the curve. In this case, this problem is a little tricky because the consumer price index is an index of the price level. We just so happen, when we do the ADAS model, we happen to use the GDP deflator, which is a GDP price index. We're using the prices of goods that are what we incorporate into our measures of GDP. So our market basket, when we do the GDP deflator, is all the goods that get included in our measure of GDP. The consumer price index is an index of the prices of a market basket that only includes those goods that consumers buy. So it's not going to include things like raw materials or inputs into production. It's not going to include intermediate goods, for instance. Nevertheless, however, the consumer price index is a measure of the price level. And so I wouldn't have expected you to guess this, but I'm telling you that if you get a problem like this, we are going to treat a rise in the consumer price index as a rise in the price level. And so I'm going to say that the price level here, even though we're not using the GDP deflator, we're still using a price index. And so I'm going to say that it's going to increase from P sub 1 to P sub 2. And because this is a change in the price index, I'm going to say this is a movement. So this is a movement. And we're going to essentially just move to a place that corresponds with this rise in the level of prices. So we're going to move to here. And if I want to consider what's happened to my quantity of output demanded as a result, I will come over to the horizontal axis and denote this as Y sub 2. And when I compare these two outputs, Y sub 1 and Y sub 2, I can see that the demand for the quantity of output measured by real GDP has actually increased. And this makes sense because even though the consumer market basket is just a part of the basket that gets factored into the GDP deflator, it still is a part that is increasing. And so we would expect that as a result of the consumer price index increasing, as a result of the price of those consumer goods increasing, that we will see the GDP deflator increase as well. And so it would make sense that our quantity of output demanded in the short run will increase as a result of an increase in the consumer price index. In part 1b, the problem says that it wants you to consider a change in the short run aggregate supply curve as a result of a fall in the price of oil, which leads producers to increase their output. So again, before I even consider this dynamic, I am first going to set up my aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, my ADAS model, where on the horizontal axis, I have the quantity of the economy's output that I denote by Y, and that I measure using real GDP. On the vertical axis, I have the price level, which I denote by P, and I'm going to measure using the GDP deflator. Okay, I'm going to draw a hypothetical short-run aggregate supply curve. Short-run aggregate supply curve. It's the first one I'm going to draw. And remember that it's rising from left to right because we are assuming that in the short run, our producers cannot affect their production costs. They cannot offset the costs of, say, a decrease in the price level onto their production costs. And so the only option they will really have is to either cut production in the case of a price decrease or increase production in the case of a price level increase. So that's different than the long run supply curve, where it's just a vertical line, where we're basically saying in that depiction that no matter the price, the level of output, our potential output, is going to stay the same. So anyway, getting back to this problem, I'm going to pick a point on this short run aggregate supply curve just to help me visualize the change that happens. And I know that this corresponds with a certain level of output that we've supplied in the short run. So this is going to be Y1, and a certain level of at a certain price level. So this is the quantity of output supplied at a certain price level, P sub 1. And now I'm going to consider this question. A fall in the price of oil leads producers to increase output. Well, the first thing I want to consider is this a movement or is this a shift in the curve? Remember that if it's a movement, then the reason for the change, the reason that producers have changed their supply, is because of a change in the price level. If the reason that they've changed their supply is not because of the price level, then we have a shift of the entire curve. In this problem, the reason why we've changed our supply is because of a fall in the price of oil. It is not because of a fall in the price level. And so I'm definitely in this case talking about a shift and not a movement. So my next step has to be, am I shifting this short run aggregate supply curve to the right or to the left? If I'm shifting it to the right, I'm arguing that the short run supply has increased. If I shift it to the left, I'm arguing that the short run aggregate supply curve, short run aggregate supply has decreased. So let's consider what happens when you have a fall in the price of oil. Well, when you have a fall in the price of oil, we can reasonably imagine that there's been a reduction in the production costs of producers, of suppliers of goods. And as a result, so the price level stays the same, but as a result of the reduction in the price of oil, suppliers are able to enjoy a lower production cost. And so as a result, remember in the short run, their only option in response to this is to increase their supply. So the price level of the economy has stayed the same, though the change in the price of oil of this one market has changed. the price the price level of the economy altogether has stayed the same. And suppliers in response will increase their production, and as a result, we will see, remember this is a shift, so this is a shift of the entire aggregate supply curve, and this is our new aggregate supply curve, short run aggregate supply sub 2. Now, when we want to consider what has been the effect on the quantity supplied, we can come over to the horizontal axis and consider our new point, y sub 2. And indeed, our supply of goods, of quantity of output to the economy has increased the way that our problem said that it does. So that's how we would depict it graphically. In part C, the problem asks you to consider the change in aggregate supply as a result of a rise in mandated retirement benefits paid to workers. So first, before I even consider this, I'm going to draw out my ADAS model, where on the horizontal axis I have quantity of output, can't get it all the way in, quantity of output, which I denote by Y and measure using real GDP. And then on the vertical axis, I am going to consider the price level, which I measure using the GDP deflator. Okay, and I denote it with P. And I'm going to draw a hypothetical short-run aggregate supply curve, SRAS sub 1, short-run aggregate supply curve, the first one. And it's rising from left to right because I'm going to assume that in the short run, my producers, my suppliers of output to the economy don't have the ability to adjust their production costs in response to changes in the price level. So the only option they really have is to either increase their quantity of output that they supply or to decrease their supply. So this is different from the long run, where in the long run I assume that they produce the same amount of output, potential output, for any price level. So I'm going to pick a point on the short run aggregate supply curve to help me visualize how things are going to change. And I know that this point corresponds to a level of output supplied, so I'm going to call this Y sub 1, and a certain price level at which my producers have supplied that output. Okay, and now I'm going to consider the question, rise in mandated retirement benefits. Okay, so now my first question to myself has to be, am I talking about a movement of the curve, or am I talking about a shift of the curve? Remember that a movement is going to come as a result of a change in the price level. When my suppliers change how much they supply because of a change in the price level in the economy, the general price level, then I'm going to move along the supply curve. No need to draw a new supply curve. However, if my suppliers are going to supply a different quantity as a result of a change in any other factor, then I am going to draw a shift. So because my suppliers are not going to change because of a change in the price level, but are instead going to change as a result of this rise in mandated retirement benefits, I am talking about a shift. Okay, so my next question to myself has to be, am I shifting to the right, in which case I am increasing my supply, or am I shifting to the left, in which case I am decreasing my supply? And so now I really need to think about the intuition of this problem. When you have a rise in mandated retirement benefits to workers, that essentially can be treated as an increase in their wage. So you can imagine maybe that the government steps in and says, look, producers, you need to increase the amount by which you give your workers retirement benefits. Now remember, in the short run, producers cannot turn around and say, okay, we'll give them an increase in the mandated retirement benefits, but we'll reduce their wage. They don't have that flexibility in the short run. their production costs are fixed in the short run. They're not flexible. So if they experience a rise in this mandated retirement benefit, their only choice in the short run, well, they can choose simply not to reduce supply, but given that our suppliers are profit maximizers, they are going to shift over to the left. They're going to reduce their supply at the same price level. Price levels in the economy have not changed, but they're going to reduce their supply. And so they're going to move over to the left and to this new point that I've just arbitrarily chosen. And that new point is going to be on an entirely new short run aggregate supply curve. So I'm going to make this sub 2, the new aggregate supply curve. And that aggregate supply curve, if you want to see what is the exact change in the quantity of output supplied, I can come down and label this Y sub 2, and I can clearly see the dynamic that my problem describes, that as a result of the rise in mandated retirement benefits paid to workers, this leads to a reduction in the quantity of output provided by my suppliers. I hope number 1 in this section makes sense. If it does not, please come see me during office hours.